That 1930s guy here, and I got a great story for you today. It's all about the Long Island Railroad 1930s and the many mishaps, misadventures, and shortcomings that they had. Now, I have nothing against the Long Island Railroad. I've rode it many times. Great service. But in the 30s, they had a lot of problems. And I'm going to go through a series of them. I'm going to start with the funny one. Well, so it wasn't funny for the guy it happened to, but it's ironic, and I'll tell you why. I'm in Brentwood right now, section of Long Island Railroad and 2nd Street. At 9:30 at night, July 21st, 1936, Palmer Jenkins, an unemployed painter, was crossing this exact spot and got his foot caught on underneath the rail somehow. Couldn't get it out. And an eastbound train coming from that direction to this was coming soon. He couldn't get his foot out, and he yelled and screamed, but there was nothing he could do. Nothing. The train couldn't stop in time, and it cut his ankle clear off. His whole foot was off. But somebody heard his screams, and they lived right at the corner of Suffolk Avenue and 2nd Street, which is right this intersection here, right at this house here. And in one of life's crazy ironies, the house is now home to a foot and ankle specialist, and it actually has a picture of an ankle. Very ironic. I had to start with that story because it's just too crazy. And but anyway, the guy found him. He got him to the hospital, Southside Hospital, which is a hospital I was born in, but that doesn't matter. And they actually had to cut 4 more inches off of his leg because he was hurt so bad. And poor Palmer Jenkins, he tried to sue the Long Island Railroad. It wasn't their fault, really. It was just a tragic accident, and the train couldn't stop in time, like I said. But it was for $100,000. He tried to sue them. After a long time in the courts, he finally settled for just $16,500. It was still a decent amount in 1937. So, by the time it was over, it was 1937. So, we're talking maybe about $350,000 today. That's pretty good. So that's the one I'm going to start with, and we got some really good, more interesting stories. You'll want to stay tuned for these. I am now at the Ronkonkoma Long Island Railroad Station, one of the main hubs that connects with Penn Station. They have a lot of trains that go back and forth throughout the day, from here to there, and many stops in between. But I'm here to talk about some interesting events that happened in the 30s. 1934 was a terrible winter for the Northeast. And I'm here in a parking garage, by the way. That's how I get this great view. But it was such a bad winter, and I mentioned this in another video. The Great South Bay actually froze over. It was so cold that winter. It doesn't happen too often. And New York City set an all-time record, at least up to that point. After 64 or 68 years of record keeping, they hit negative 14.3 degrees in Central Park. All-time cold for the time. And there was a bunch of snowstorms. One to start the month, one in the middle, and one to end the month. And the one at the end was the worst one. It was like 10 to 15 inches of snow, depending on where you were. And Long Island Railroad shut down abruptly for 2 days. People were stranded, and this was during the week. So the people were stranded, commuters were stranded in Penn Station, and other stations couldn't get home. And they were irate, and for a good reason. Because they're supposed to have equipment to deal with that. And they did have equipment, but it was so old and obsolete that it started breaking down. Because they had to use it twice already that month. and it was no good. And they couldn't clear the tracks. They couldn't clear the third rail. That's the important electric rail that they had to clear to get the trains going. And after a day, they were able to make trains to Jamaica. And then the next day, they were able to make it to Hicksville. And then they resumed a full schedule on the third day. But a lot of people had a hard time getting home that day, especially because the roads, well, they weren't what they are today. It was hard to get around when it's that much snow and such a storm. And what made people mad was that New Jersey and Connecticut, the trains were delayed, but they still kept running. They didn't shut down at all. And the Long Island Railroad had shut down for 2 days. And what they did, when the equipment broke down, they started hiring people. They hired like 1,500 people on the spot just to, by hand, shovel the entire length of the railroad on Long Island so they can get the trains going. And obviously that took a long time. And it was people afterward, they demanded their refunds. Eventually they did give in and give money back, but it was a big controversy. They had to go before a transit commission and explain exactly why this happened. Especially people were angry because the Long Island Railroad was slightly more expensive than the New Jersey and Connecticut railroads. And there was a lot more commuters on this railroad than other ones. So the Long Island Railroad should have been the most prepared, not the least prepared. And the president of the Long Island Railroad at the time, they were owned by Pennsylvania Railroad, much larger company with a lot of money. And he gave a lot of excuses, but some of the interesting things he said in the hearing were that the board of the Long Island Railroad only met 4 times a year. And their meetings only lasted about 10 minutes to a half hour, he said. And they just never got around to getting to new equipment. And they were sorry. That was pretty much the sum of what he said. And so it was very bad publicity for the Long Island Railroad. A lot of people were pretty upset. Another reason people were upset with the Long Island Railroad during those storms, the last storm especially, was because they did a bad job of telling people that the railroad was shut down. So people were waiting, just thinking the trains were late at all these stations, but they were really not able to run at all. And a lot of people never knew. They waited hours for these trains before they, tried to secure some other way to get home. So it was a mess, really bad publicity, the Long Island Railroad, especially, like I said, they were one of the more profitable railroads in the country. So the fact that they were this unprepared was just outrageous, and they had a lot of explaining to do. And this got even worse because of a fare controversy. Now, the federal government, since World War I, controlled the railroads, pretty much complete oversight over what the railroads could charge and their schedules and all that. They decided they were too important to leave completely to private ownership. They were privately owned, but the government pretty much set all the regulations for them. And they decided, because almost none of the railroads are making profits. Long Island Railroad was one of the few that was actually making profits. Slight profits, not much. But they decided to test in the South, reducing the standard fare. The maximum fare was 3 cents per mile that a railroad could charge for passengers. And so all railroads did the limit because they needed as much money as they could get. Like I said, they were mostly in debt anyway. And they lowered it to 2 cents, and it was a hit in the South. It worked great. All these railroads started making more money because more people were riding for the cheaper rates, and the fact that the country was recovering from the Depression helped, of course. And so they decided to extend it to the entire country, the regulation. But, of course, the Long Island Railroad took it to court. They said they were not going to lower their rates to 2 cents because they were an intra-state railroad. They only did New York, and they were completely within New York State. Long Island, New York City was all they did, so they were not going to do it. The federal government, they said, had no jurisdiction over them because they were interstate. But the federal government argued back that the Pennsylvania Railroad owned the Long Island Railroad, and the Pennsylvania Railroad was a nationwide company. So since they're the ones that control what rates and the policies of the Long Island Railroad, that they were interstate. And so it was a big court battle. I think it took about a year, but it took many months. The railroad fought. They refused to raise, to lower their rates. Besides, the courts were trying to pressure them to lower it in the meantime, and they still wouldn't do it. Until finally, in June 1936, the court told them that they have until July 1st to lower their rates to 2 cents, that they were an interstate company because they were owned by the Pennsylvania Railroad. But that was another episode of really bad publicity. Here's this one of the few railroads making profits in the country, and they're refusing to abide by the rates that all the other companies are already doing. And so, Long Islanders were very upset because they were paying more money than anyone else in the country to travel on the trains. And this was one of the busiest, most profitable trains. And so, yeah, it was another 2 bad episodes in the mid-30s, publicity-wise. And, yeah, it was pretty bad. I am now in Holbrook, New York, which is just to the east of Ronkonkoma, and I am under Patchogue Holbrook Road, which is on this overpass here. But there used to not always be an overpass. In the 30s, this was just a road connected normally and went over the railroad. Just the only thing that warned you the railroad was a sign to stop, look, and listen. That was very common. There weren't very many gates or anything to protect people back then from railroad crossings. You just had to be careful. And unfortunately, there was the worst tragedy of the Long Island Railroad had to face during the 1930s. Occurred right here when on December the 20th, 1935, just before Christmas, sadly, a morning bus carrying high school students to Sayville High School, this was in the Sayville district at the time, crossed the railroad tracks too late, and the train tried to stop, but it hit the rear end of the bus, knocked it 150 feet, injured a bunch, and killed 3. And the story is even more tragic than that because 2 of them were sisters, Alice Bedell and Iana Bedell, 18 and 17 years old, died, and they normally would not have been crossing this railroad because they lived on the other side and were a later stop. They usually got picked up after the bus crossed the railroad, but today they were mailing all their Christmas cards and they had to go to the post office, and that required them to cross the railroad tracks before they went to school, so they got picked up at a spot that was not their normal location. And so it was a terrible tragedy. The other person that died was Robert Champ. He was 17 years old. And the fact that this happened right before Christmas, of course, made it worse. That day, actually, at Sayville High School, during the day, they were going to have a choir singing of Christmas songs where parents and others were invited to hear the Sayville choir sing, and both those sisters were both in the choir. So they had to cancel that, obviously. And it was even worse was the fact that this driver, who was ultimately at fault and charged with manslaughter and sentenced to a year in jail, wasn't the normal driver. The normal driver was sick. This was an emergency substitute driver who was not as experienced as the other driver, who had to take these kids. And the community was very upset. And they were angry because they had been protesting for 7 years to have some more protection for this railroad crossing, because they said it was the busiest crossing in the area. And they are always worried about accidents happening here. And so they protested and nothing got done. And this terrible tragedy happened, and the whole community was just devastated. And the driver's name was August Blask, I'm sorry. And he felt terrible about it, but it's something he could do. And there was a lot of bad publicity, obviously, for the Long Island Railroad. And it was so bad, actually, they took out advertisements in the paper pleading with people not to blame them for this accident, that it was the bus driver's fault. He should not have risked trying to cross the railroads to beat the train. And they had full-page ads that said lines like this: is, "Gentlemen, be fair. Blaming the Long Island Railroad is wrong, unjust, and unfair." Those 3 words in all caps. And it also said, "You know in your soul and in your heart that this tragedy is not the fault of the Long Island Railroad." And so, I mean, it maybe took it a little too far, but it just goes to show how much anger how much animosity there was against the Long Island Railroad in the 1930s. It was not a very popular institution, service. And just to add insult to injury, while this accident happened, they were in court that week protesting the 3-cent, 2-cent fare controversy, and they were going over the profits that they were making were substantially more than most other railroads. That was brought into court just that week that this accident happened. So that compounded the anger, and also the fact that it was brought out that week that despite these profits, they had no excuse to have higher rates because they were not building more railroad, that they had only built 3 miles of new road since 1899. So they wanted to know why they thought it was necessary for them to be charging more than other railroads that may have been expanding. So that was another sticking point that made people very upset. We are going to finish our video in a familiar place, Ronkonkoma, town where I grew up, and the place where we did 2 other videos. But here, just days after the whole 2-cent fare, literally, of 1 day after the court ruled that the railroad had to reduce their rates, a tragic accident happened at this intersection of Ocean Avenue and the Long Island Railroad. It was a day after the 2-cent fare, and connecting with our first story with the ankle guy, this was just 31 days before that occurred. A train, eastbound train, coming from that direction to that direction, was passing through while a gasoline truck owned by the town of Islip Highway Division. I don't know exactly who they supplied the gasoline for, but there was 2 guys in it, and they tried to beat the train. Didn't make it. Again, just like the other ones, there was nothing but a sign that told people to stop and look before you cross. That was the only safety thing they had here. And it hit the truck, explosion. The 2 guys died. No one else got hurt, fortunately. But the 2 guys were Adolf Cervenka of Bohemia and Herman Kodes of East Iceland. And they unfortunately passed away. And so I'll end our train stories on a bit of a tragic note, but the train was not derailed and was put back in service, so I guess they made the trains pretty hardy. But yeah, there was a lot of interesting, exciting events for the Long Island Railroad in the 1930s. But I just want to reiterate that I have nothing against the railroad. It's just they had a tough decade in the 30s, and it's worth looking into. And I thank everyone for watching. Please like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video. I'm pretty sure you found at least some of it interesting. Thank you.